Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time, beyond the reach of recorded history, beyond the first cities, beyond the first farms, back to when the world was ice and stone and endless sky. Back to when our ancestors discovered the secrets that would keep them alive through nights that could kill with a single breath. If you find yourself learning something or simply enjoying the way this story unfolds, consider tapping like and subscribing. That small action helps this kind of long-form science-based content reach more people who might need a different way to learn. And if you're willing to share, drop a comment and tell us, do you use this to fall asleep or focus while working? What time and place are you listening from? We'd love to know what kind of sapiens you are. Now, if you happen to drift off during one of the chapters, no worries. I've added timestamps in the description, so tomorrow you can pick up exactly where the story left off because this one is worth finishing. In the deep quiet of a winter night, 30,000 years ago, when the world was younger and wilder, when ice stretched across continents like a frozen ocean of dreams, there was darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom, with central heating humming invisibly in the walls and electric blankets waiting at the flip of a switch. This was the kind of darkness that had teeth, the kind that whispered promises of eternal sleep to anyone foolish enough to close their eyes unprepared. Picture this, you are one of the first humans. Your brain, already magnificent, holds the same capacity for love, fear, creativity, and hope that yours does today. But the world around you is a crystalline nightmare of survival. The air itself can kill. The ground beneath your feet is harder than stone, frozen deeper than graves. And tonight, like every night for the past 6 months, the temperature will drop low enough to steal the breath from your lungs and turn your blood to ice. Yet somehow, impossibly, your ancestors survived. Not just survived, they thrived. They raised children in this frozen hell. They created art. They told stories. They fell in love and dreamed of spring. How? The answer lies in 7 ancient secrets. 7 methods discovered through desperation, refined through necessity, and passed down through the long chain of survival that leads directly to you, sitting here now, warm and safe, listening to this story by the light of screens instead of flames. But to understand these secrets, we must first understand where they live. We must understand the cave. Not every hollow in the earth would do. In fact, most caves were death traps disguised as shelter. Choose wrong, and your family would never see another dawn. In understanding the ancient language and in mineral and shadow, our ancestors developed an almost supernatural ability to sense which caves would cradle life and which would steal it away during the long, hungry nights. They sought the caves that breathed with the earth's rhythm. Caves positioned where ancient geological forces had carved the rock in just the right way, creating natural chimneys that would draw smoke upward while pulling fresh air down through hidden cracks and crevices. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were the earth's lungs, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. The perfect cave faced southeast, catching the first pale rays of dawn when they were most precious, storing the sun's meager warmth in stone walls that would release it slowly through the dark hours. North-facing caves were tombs. West-facing caves became wind tunnels that could freeze a person's blood in their veins. But direction was only the beginning. The cave mouth had to be shaped just so wide enough to allow easy passage for a family carrying their possessions, yet narrow enough that it could be defended or sealed against the bitter wind and the hungry things that prowled in darkness. Too wide, and the precious heated air would pour out into the night water from a broken vessel. Too narrow, and smoke would trap inside, suffocating the very people it was meant to warm. They learned to test the stone itself by laying their hands against the walls and feeling for the subtle warmth that indicated thermal mass. Stone thick enough to absorb heat during the day and radiate it back during the night. Thin, walled caves were beautiful but useless. Pretty crystalline chambers that offered about as much protection as sleeping under the stars. The floor told its own story. It had to slope gently toward the entrance, allowing cold air to drain away like invisible water, while warm air pooled in the deeper chambers where families would sleep. Caves with reverse slopes became cold sumps, collecting frigid air in exactly the places where people needed warmth most desperately. Water was life, but it was also death. The perfect cave needed to be close to a water source that they wouldn't exhaust themselves hauling ice and snow for melting, yet far enough that spring floods wouldn't turn their shelter into an underground river. They learned to read the high water marks scratched into cave walls by ancient floods, understanding that nature always reclaimed her patterns. And then there were the signs of previous inhabitants, not just other humans, but bears. Cave bears were the rightful owners of these stone sanctuaries, massive creatures that could weigh half a ton and had claws designed for exactly this kind of territorial dispute. Finding fresh claw marks or scat meant finding another cave, because sharing space with a family of cave bears was not negotiation humans were equipped to win. But sometimes, in the most precious caves, they found older signs. Cave paintings left by humans who had survived here before. Simple handprints pressed against stone walls like ancient signatures saying, "We were here. We lived. We made it through." These caves carried a different kind of warmth, the warmth of human success, of survival passed down through the long chain of ancestors who had faced the same darkness and won. The acoustic properties mattered too, though our ancestors might not have understood the physics. Caves with good resonance allowed them to hear approaching predators or weather changes from far outside, while caves that deadened sound left them vulnerable to surprise attacks. They learned to clap their hands and listen to the echo, reading the story the stone told about its shape and size and safety. Wind patterns revealed themselves to those who knew how to look. Caves that channeled wind created deadly drafts that no amount of fuel could overcome. But caves that broke the wind just right, causing it to eddy and swirl, could create natural heat distribution systems that circulated warm air throughout the entire space. Some caves came with natural shelving, stone ledges that could hold precious possessions off the cold ground. Others had natural hearth areas where the stone was already blackened by ancient fires, marked by generations of humans who had discovered the same perfect spots for building flames that would warm without smoking, heat without consuming too much precious fuel. The very best caves had secondary chambers, deeper alcoves that could serve as sleeping areas, storage spaces, or retreat positions if the entrance became compromised. These caves were like underground houses, with different rooms for different purposes. Natural architecture designed by time and pressure and the patient carving of underground streams. They learned to feel for air currents with wet fingers, understanding that subtle movements of air revealed the hidden connections between different parts of the cave system. Good air flow meant warmth would circulate and smoke would clear. Dead air meant suffocation waiting in the shadows. The geology itself had to be stable. Caves prone to rockfall were avoided, no matter how perfect they seemed in other ways. They learned to recognize the signs: loose stones balanced precariously overhead, stress fractures in the ceiling, the subtle groaning sounds that indicated stone under pressure. Better to sleep cold under the stars than warm under tons of rock that might fall during the night. And always, they looked for the signs of game trails nearby. Not too close, they didn't want to sleep in the middle of a wildlife highway, but close enough that hunting wouldn't require days-long expeditions in the killing cold. The perfect cave balanced accessibility to food with protection from predators, positioned like a fortress that commanded the surrounding territory while remaining hidden from the most dangerous threats. These were the foundations of survival, the geographic lottery that determined whether families lived or died during the frozen months. But finding the perfect cave was only the beginning. What they did inside that cave, how they turned stone and shadow into something approaching warmth and safety, that was where the real magic began. Because once you had the right cave, you had to learn to tame fire itself. Fire was not just a tool to our ancestors. Fire was a god, temperamental and dangerous, requiring constant attention and offerings of wood and breath and devotion. Get it right, and fire would keep your family alive through the long darkness. Get it wrong, and fire would consume everything you loved before dancing away into the night, leaving only cold ashes and colder death. But this wasn't just about building a campfire and moving it indoors. This was about creating a controlled inferno inside a stone chamber, managing combustion and airflow, and heat distribution with a precision that would challenge modern engineers. This was about turning a cave into a furnace without turning it into a crematorium. The placement of the fire pit was everything. Too close to the entrance, and the heat would pour out into the night like an offering to the darkness. Too deep in the cave, and smoke would pool in the sleeping areas, suffocating the very people it was meant to protect. The perfect fire pit sat at the exact point where heat distribution balanced with smoke management, a location determined not measurement, but by intuition earned through generations of trial and error. They carved these fire pits directly into the stone floor when possible, creating permanent hearths that would serve multiple seasons. The depth was critical shallow enough that heat wouldn't get trapped at ground level, deep enough that burning logs wouldn't roll out and ignite bedding or stored supplies. The edges were shaped to create subtle wind breaks, protecting the flames from drafts that could scatter sparks or steal heat. But the pit was only the beginning. The real engineering marvel was the ventilation system they created using nothing but understanding of how air moved through stone chambers. They learned to read smoke like a language, understanding that the way flames danced and flickered told stories about air pressure, humidity, and the complex physics of heated gases rising through confined spaces. The smoke hole was their chimney, but it couldn't just be a hole. It had to be positioned where rising hot air would naturally want to flow, following the path of least resistance through the cave's natural architecture. They learned to enhance these natural draft patterns, sometimes piling stones to direct airflow, sometimes clearing debris that blocked the invisible rivers of heated air. Near the floor, they created intentional gaps that allowed cold air to flow in, feeding oxygen to the fire, while establishing circulation patterns that would distribute warmth throughout the sleeping area. These weren't random cracks. These were carefully maintained airways, cleared of ice and debris, positioned to create a steady flow of fresh air that wouldn't create uncomfortable drafts. The result was a natural convection system that moved warm air through the entire cave while pulling smoke and dangerous gases up and out. Hot air rose from the fire, flowed along the ceiling, cooled as it moved toward the sleeping areas, then sank back toward the floor, where it'd be warmed again and continue the cycle. They had invented central heating using nothing but physics and patience. Hunger. Fuel management required the kind of precision that would make modern efficiency experts weep with envy. Every piece of wood had to be considered not just for its ability to burn, but for how it burned. Different woods created different amounts of heat, different amounts of smoke, different burning characteristics that affected everything from air quality to heat output to how long the coals would last through the night. Hardwoods like oak burned hot and long, were difficult to ignite and created dense smoke if not properly seasoned. Softwoods like pine caught fire easily and burned bright but consumed quickly and could create dangerous flare-ups. They learned to combine different types of wood in careful sequences, starting fires with easily ignited kindling, building heat with medium woods, then maintaining temperature through the night with slow-burning hardwoods that would smolder until dawn. But wood wasn't always available. During the worst weather, when venturing outside meant death, they burned whatever they could find. Animal fat rendered slowly in stone lamps, creating steady heat with minimal smoke. Dried doing from herbivores burned surprisingly well and produced decent heat, though the psychological adjustment to burning excrement for warmth probably took some getting used to. Bone, particularly the long bones of large animals, could be split and burned, creating intense heat that lasted for hours. They learned to crack bones in specific ways, exposing the marrow that would ignite and burn like natural candles. Antlers burned clean and hot, creating coals that could be maintained with small additions of other fuel. The fire itself had to be built with architectural precision. They developed specific stacking patterns that maximized airflow while creating stable structures that wouldn't collapse and scatter burning materials. The tepi method used smaller pieces arranged in cone shapes that created natural chimneys, drawing air up through the center while providing multiple surfaces for ignition. Log cabin structures used larger pieces stacked in alternating layers, creating air pockets that fed oxygen to the flames while building substantial coal beds that would last through the long night. They learned to leave gaps between logs that were exactly the right size, large enough for airflow, and small enough that the structure wouldn't collapse into dangerous cascades of burning wood. Fire maintenance was a sacred duty that rotated among family members throughout the night. Someone always stayed awake, feeding small amounts of fuel to maintain steady heat without creating dangerous flare-ups. They learned to read the coals like others might read books, understanding that different colors and patterns indicated different temperatures and burning characteristics. The fire tender watched for signs that the ventilation system was becoming compromised, smoke that refused to rise, flames that flickered in unusual patterns, the subtle changes in air movement that indicated blockages or wind shifts outside the cave. They knew how to adjust dampers made from flat stones, how to temporarily block or open air passages to maintain proper flow. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to bank fires for the night, creating coal beds that would smolder through the dark hours while maintaining enough heat to keep families alive. And banking required covering the coals with just the right amount of ash, enough to slow combustion, not enough to smother the flames entirely. Too little ash, and the fire would burn too hot and consume all the fuel before dawn. Too much ash, and the fire would die, leaving nothing but cold stones and colder death. They learned to create secondary heat sources that worked with the main fire, heated stones that absorbed warmth during the evening and radiated it back during the coldest pre-dawn hours. These stones were carefully selected for their ability to hold heat without cracking, positioned where they could absorb maximum warmth without interfering with the ventilation system. Some families developed elaborate systems of heated stones that were rotated throughout the night, keeping some stones in the fire while others cooled slowly in the sleeping areas. The warm stones were wrapped in animal hides to prevent burns while maximizing heat transfer, creating the world's first heated blankets. Fire was life, but fire was also light, and light meant hope during the endless darkness of Ice Age winters. The flames pushed back more than just the cold. They pushed back the psychological weight of months without sunlight, the crushing despair that could kill as surely as freezing temperatures. Around these fires, families told the stories that kept their culture alive. They made the tools that kept their bodies alive. They planned the hunts that would provide food, the migrations that would follow the herds, and the seasonal movements that had sustained their people countless generations of ice and darkness. But for all their skill with flame and smoke and heated stone, fire alone wasn't enough. The ground beneath them remained an enemy, a massive heat sink that could drain the warmth from their bodies faster than any fire could replace it. Learning to defeat the frozen earth beneath, their feet required a different kind of engineering, one that turned the cave floor itself into an alley in the fight for survival. The ground was a thief. Silent, patient, invisible, it stole heat from human bodies with the ruthless efficiency of an assassin. No matter how perfectly they managed their fires, no matter how ingeniously they channeled warm air through their caves, the frozen earth beneath them remained a constant threat. A massive reservoir of cold that could drain life from sleeping bodies in a single night. But our ancestors learned to turn this enemy into an ally, developing sophisticated ground insulation systems that transformed the cave floor from a death trap into a foundation for survival. These weren't simple beds, made from whatever materials happened to be available. These were engineered thermal barriers, carefully constructed heating systems that worked with the physics of heat transfer to create warm sleeping areas that could maintain temperature through the darkest hours. The first step was understanding the nature of their enemy. Frozen ground isn't just cold, it's actively cold, constantly pulling heat away from anything that touches it through conduction, convection, and radiation. Direct contact with frozen earth through even thick animal hides would suck the warmth from a human body faster than the most efficient fire could replace it. Sleep directly on the ground during an ice age winter and you wouldn't wake up. They learned to create barriers that broke this heat transfer, using materials that trapped air, nature's perfect insulator, in countless tiny pockets that prevented thermal conduction. But they couldn't just pile random materials on the ground and hope for the best. The construction had to be systematic, layered, engineered to work as a complete system. The foundation layer was often dried grass, gathered during the brief growing seasons and stored in massive quantities for winter use. But not just any grass would do. They sought out specific species that remained flexible when dried, grasses that wouldn't compress into useless mats under the weight of sleeping bodies. These grasses were layered to create natural springs that maintained air pockets even under pressure. Reed mats were woven when materials allowed, creating structured barriers that held their shape and maintained insulation properties through months of use. The weaving patterns weren't decorative, they were functional, designed to trap maximum air while providing structural integrity that wouldn't collapse during sleep. These mats were layered in specific sequences, with the grain running in different directions to prevent heat from finding straight pathways to the ground. But organic materials alone weren't enough. They learned to create heated bed systems that actively generated warmth throughout the night. Smooth stones were selected for their ability to absorb and release heat without cracking from thermal shock. These stones were heated in the fire during the evening hours, then carefully transported to the sleeping areas where they were buried in the insulation layers. The stone placement was critical. Too close to the surface, and the heated rocks would burn sleeping skin or create uncomfortable hot spots. Too deep in the insulation, and the heat wouldn't reach the people who needed it. They learned to create stone arrangements that provided even heat distribution, with larger stones for long-term warmth and smaller stones for quick heat near the surface. Some families developed sophisticated heated bed systems that approached the complexity of modern radiant floor heating. They learned to hollow out sleeping areas in the cave floor, creating shaped depressions that were filled with heated stones, then covered with layers of insulation that held the warmth while allowing comfortable sleep on top. Animal hides provided the critical barrier between humans and the insulation system below. But the hides weren't just thrown down randomly. They were arranged in specific sequences based on the thermal properties of different animals. Mammoth hide, when available, provided thick leather barriers that were virtually windproof, while remaining flexible enough for comfortable sleeping. Reindeer hides were prized for their incredibly dense, for that created countless tiny air pockets, natural insulation that rivaled modern synthetic materials. Bear hides offered both insulation and psychological comfort. Sleeping on the hide of a defeated predator provided both warmth and symbolic protection from the dangers that prowled outside the cave. The fur arrangements followed specific patterns that maximized heat retention while managing moisture. Fur side up trapped warm air rising from heated stones and sleeping bodies. Leather side up created waterproof barriers that prevented ground moisture from wicking up into the sleeping area. They learned to alternate these arrangements, creating laminated systems that worked like primitive sleeping bags. But perhaps most ingeniously, they learned to shape the sleeping areas themselves, creating contoured beds that worked with human body mechanics to maximize warmth retention. These weren't flat surfaces. They were carved depressions that cradled sleeping bodies, reducing the surface area exposed to air while creating warm air pockets that surrounded sleeping families. The depressions were shaped to accommodate multiple people sleeping close together, with deeper areas for adults who generated more body heat and shallower areas for children who needed to stay closer to the heat sources. Family sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were strategic heat management systems that positioned the warmest bodies where they could best warm the most vulnerable family members. Edge barriers prevented warm air from spilling out of the sleeping depressions. These barriers were built from stones or packed earth, creating thermal walls that channeled heated air while blocking cold drafts. The barriers were often covered with additional insulation, creating sleeping alcoves that functioned like individual heating chambers within the larger cave. The maintenance of these sleeping systems required daily attention. Insulation materials had to be fluffed and redistributed to maintain their thermal properties. Moisture from breath and perspiration had to be managed to prevent the insulation from becoming damp and losing its effectiveness. Stones had to be reheated and repositioned, hides cleaned and repositioned for optimal thermal performance. They developed techniques for managing moisture that wouldn't be out of place in modern outdoor gear design. Absorbent materials like dried moss were placed in strategic locations to wick away moisture without compromising insulation. Ventilation channels allowed moisture-laden air to escape while preserving heated air in the sleeping areas. During extreme cold snaps, multiple heated bed systems were sometimes linked together, creating shared thermal zones where extended families could pool their heat resources. These communal sleeping arrangements might seem crowded by modern standards, but they were sophisticated survival systems that maximized the heat output of every individual while minimizing the energy required to maintain life, sustaining temperatures. Some caves show evidence of elaborate sleeping chambers that were used season after season, with permanent stone arrangements and carefully maintained insulation systems that improved over years of use. These weren't temporary camping spots, they were engineered thermal environments that represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of survivors. The heated bed systems worked in conjunction with the fire management systems, creating complete thermal environments where heated stones provided warmth from below, while carefully managed fires provided warmth from above. The combination created sleeping areas that could maintain temperatures comfortable enough for survival, even when the air outside dropped to levels that would kill in minutes. But all of this careful ground insulation engineering would be useless without understanding how to manage the heat source that mattered most, the human body itself. Learning to optimize internal heat production while preventing heat loss from their own bodies required knowledge that transformed survival from endurance to actual comfort during the long winter nights. The human body is a furnace that burns at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, a biological engine that converts food into heat with an efficiency that would make engineers envious. But during Ice Age winters, when ambient temperatures dropped low enough to freeze saliva before it hit the ground, even the most perfectly functioning human metabolism wasn't enough to maintain life without understanding how to optimize, conserve, and strategically deploy the body's own heat production. Our ancestors became masters of human thermal dynamics, developing techniques for internal heat generation that worked with the body's natural systems while creating external barriers that trapped every precious calorie of warmth their bodies produced. They learned that survival wasn't just about staying warm, it was about becoming warm, turning their own bodies into heat sources powerful enough to sustain life through months of killing cold. Pre-sleep heat generation was a carefully choreographed ritual that began hours before anyone lay down to sleep. This wasn't random activity designed to warm up. It was systematic internal heat production that raised core body temperature while avoiding the sweat and exhaustion that could prove fatal during the night ahead. Specific exercises were developed that generated internal heat while strengthening the muscles that would be needed for winter survival tasks. Isometric exercises that pitted muscle groups against each other created internal heat without requiring excessive movement in confined cave spaces. They learned to tense and release muscle groups in sequences that promoted circulation while generating the kind of internal warmth that would carry over into the sleeping period. Breathing techniques created internal heat through controlled hyperventilation that increased blood flow and metabolic rate without causing dangerous oxygen debt. These weren't random deep breathing exercises, They were precisely timed respiratory patterns that flooded the body with oxygen while creating internal heat through increased cellular metabolism. Strategic food consumption provided fuel for the internal furnace that would burn through the night. Not just any food, but specific combinations of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates that provided sustained energy release over many hours. They learned that timing was everything. Too early, and the heat would dissipate before sleep. Too late, and the digestive process would interfere with rest while drawing heat away from the extremities to support digestion. High-fat foods like rendered animal fat, bone marrow, and fatty meat provided the slow-burning fuel that could sustain internal heat production through many hours of sleep. These weren't just calorie sources, they were metabolic time release systems that fed the body's furnace throughout the night. They learned to consume these foods in quantities that maximized heat production without causing digestive distress. But generating internal heat was only half the equation. They had to learn to trap and conserve that heat using clothing systems that worked as sophisticated thermal management tools. This wasn't just about wearing more layers, it was about understanding how different materials, arrangements, and techniques could multiply the effectiveness of the body's heat production. Base layers made from the finest, softest animal skins stayed in direct contact with skin, managing moisture while providing insulation that moved with the body. These base layers were often made from the hides of smaller animals like rabbits or foxes, processed to maintain flexibility while providing thermal protection. The softness wasn't luxury, it was necessity, preventing chafing and irritation that could create wounds vulnerable to infection during the long winter months. Insulation layers trapped air around the body core, creating thermal barriers that prevented heat loss while allowing enough air circulation to manage moisture. Bird feathers, when available, provided insulation that was lighter and more efficient than fur, creating pockets of trapped air that formed perfect thermal barriers. Down from waterfowl was especially prized for its exceptional insulation properties, although acquiring enough down for effective insulation required successful hunting of multiple birds. Fur layers provided both insulation and wind protection, creating outer barriers that sealed the thermal system while maintaining flexibility for movement. Different furs had different properties. Wolverine fur didn't accumulate ice from breath condensation, making it ideal for face and hood areas. Wolf fur provided excellent insulation while remaining relatively lightweight. Bear fur was incredibly warm but required careful processing to maintain flexibility. The layering system wasn't just about adding thickness, it was about creating air gaps between different materials that multiplied the insulation effect. They learned to arrange layers so that body heat would warm the air trapped between materials, creating personal thermal environments that could maintain comfortable temperatures even in extreme cold. Strategic coverage focused on the areas where heat loss was most critical. The head, neck, and torso received the heaviest insulation because losing heat from these areas affected the entire body's ability to maintain temperature. Arms and legs were important but secondary. Protecting the core meant the body could continue sending warm blood to the extremities. Extremity protection required specialized techniques because hands and feet were the first areas to suffer from reduced circulation when the body began conserving heat for vital organs. Mittens rather than gloves provided better insulation by allowing fingers to warm each other while maintaining dexterity for essential tasks. Multiple layers of thin materials often worked better than single thick layers, creating air pockets while maintaining flexibility. Foot warming was critical for survival because cold feet could trigger the body's cold response, reducing circulation throughout the entire system. They learned to wrap feet in multiple layers of fur and insulation, sometimes inserting heated stones or other warming materials inside the wrappings to provide external heat sources that worked with the body's circulation. The tucking technique was essential for maintaining heat in critical areas during sleep. Hands were tucked into armpits or against the torso where body heat was concentrated, and knees were drawn up to reduce surface area exposed to cold air while bringing more of the body's mass into the thermal core. Heads were covered and faces partially buried to prevent heat loss from the large surface area of the skull. They learned to sleep in positions that maximized heat retention while maintaining circulation to all extremities. Fetal positions reduced exposed surface area while protecting vital organs. Side sleeping with knees drawn up created thermal pockets while maintaining airway clearance. Multiple people sleeping close together shared body heat while maintaining individual comfort. Shared sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were strategic heat multiplication systems. Adults with higher metabolic rates were positioned to warm children and elderly family members who couldn't generate as much internal heat. These arrangements created thermal zones where the combined heat production of multiple people could maintain life, sustaining temperatures for the entire group. They understood that heat generation during sleep was different from heat generation during active periods. The metabolic rate decreased during sleep, requiring external heat sources or stored internal heat to maintain temperature through the night. A strategic positioning near heated stones or banked fires could provide external heat that supplemented the body's reduced heat production during sleep. Pre-dawn warming became a critical technique for surviving the coldest part of the night. The hours before sunrise were typically the coldest, when fires had burned low and thermal mass was at minimum temperature. They learned to time wake periods to coincide with these cold periods, adding fuel to fires and regenerating internal heat through movement and breathing techniques before the most dangerous cold could threaten their survival. Moisture management was crucial because lost heat 25 times faster than dry skin. They learned to regulate activity and clothing to prevent excessive sweating during the day, understanding that moisture trapped in clothing become deadly when temperatures dropped at night. Strategic ventilation of clothing systems allowed moisture to escape while maintaining insulation properties. But even the most sophisticated body heat management help if their skin was exposed to the killing winds and sub-zero temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes. Protecting their exposed skin required developing natural barriers that could shield human flesh from conditions that no amount of clothing could fully defend against. When the wind carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin, when the air itself became a weapon that could freeze flesh solid in the time it takes to draw a breath, clothing alone wasn't enough. Our ancestors needed to transform their skin itself into armor against the cold, using natural materials to create protective barriers that could shield human flesh from conditions no terrestrial creature was designed to survive. These weren't cosmetic applications or primitive beauty rituals. This was biochemical engineering that used animal fats, plant materials, and fire-created substances to build waterproof, heat-retaining, wind-resistant barriers directly on the skin surface. They learned to turn human flesh into something that could endure what should have been impossible, direct exposure to Ice Age conditions that would kill unprotected skin in minutes. Animal fat was the foundation of their skin protection systems, but not just any fat would do. Different animals provided fats with different properties and different melting points, different abilities to penetrate skin and provide lasting protection. They became biochemists working with natural materials, understanding how different fats interacted with human skin and environmental conditions. Mammoth fat was the ultimate prize when it could be obtained. The fat layer from these massive creatures was incredibly thick, hunger, with a consistency that could be rendered into protective coatings that lasted for days without reapplication. Mammoth fat had a melting point that worked perfectly with human body temperature, solid enough to form a protective barrier in extreme cold, but soft enough to remain pliable against warm skin. But mammoths weren't always available, so they learned to work with other animal fats that provided different advantages. Bear fat was incredibly thick and long-lasting, creating waterproof barriers that could protect skin for extended periods. The high concentration of calories in bear fat meant it provided not just protection, but actual nutrition that could be absorbed through the skin over time. Seal fat, when coastal peoples could obtain it, provided superior waterproof qualities that were essential for surviving conditions where snow and ice would melt against body heat only to refreeze on exposed skin. The thick blubber layer that kept seals alive in Arctic waters could do the same for humans, creating barriers that shed moisture while retaining heat. Deer fat was gentler and easier to obtain, making it ideal for children whose skin was more sensitive to harsh applications. The fat from deer was also easier to mix with other materials, creating compound, protective coatings that combined the benefits of multiple substances. Rabbit fat was thin and absorbed quickly, making it perfect for areas around the eyes and mouth where thicker applications would interfere with vision or eating. But fat alone, while effective, wasn't the complete solution, and they learned to enhance these natural oils with materials that multiplied their protective properties, creating compound barriers that could withstand conditions that would overwhelm simple fat applications. Charcoal from specific types of wood became a critical component of their skin protection systems. But this wasn't just any charcoal, it was carefully selected ash from hardwoods that created fine, even particles that could be mixed with fat to create protective pastes. The carbon particles did more than just darken the mixture. They absorbed and retained heat from any available source, including body heat, fire warmth, and even the pale winter sun. Different woods created ash with different properties. Oak charcoal produced fine, dense particles that created smooth, even coatings. Pine charcoal was lighter and easier to spread, but didn't provide the same heat retention properties. Birch charcoal had natural antiseptic properties that helped prevent infections in small cuts and abrasions that were inevitable during winter survival activities. The mixing process was itself a skill that required understanding of proportions and consistency. Too much fat, and the mixture would slide off skin in cold conditions. Too much charcoal, and the coating would crack and flake away, leaving skin vulnerable. The perfect mixture created a paste that could be applied evenly, dried to a protective barrier that moved with the skin, and lasted through hours of exposure to extreme conditions. Application techniques were as important as the materials themselves. The paste had to be applied in thin, even layers that covered every exposed area without creating thick buildups that would crack or interfere with movement. They learned to work the mixtures into the skin using circular motions that helped the fat penetrate while ensuring the charcoal particles were evenly distributed. Special attention was paid to vulnerable areas where skin was thinnest or most exposed to wind. The face required careful application around the eyes and mouth, protecting skin while maintaining vision and the ability to eat and drink. Hands needed protection that wouldn't interfere with gripping tools or weapons. Feet required coatings that could withstand contact with snow and ice while remaining flexible enough for walking. They learned to create different formulations for different conditions, and light applications for moderately cold days that provided protection without creating thick barriers. Heavy applications for extreme conditions that created almost waterproof barriers capable of withstanding direct contact with snow and ice. Emergency formulations that could be applied quickly when unexpected weather threatened exposed family members. Some groups developed sophisticated multi-layer application systems that worked like natural cosmetics designed for survival rather than beauty. Base layers of pure fat provided moisture and basic protection. Middle layers mixed with charcoal provided heat retention and wind resistance. Top layers included additional materials that enhanced specific protective properties. Plant materials, when available, added additional protect properties to the fat and charcoal base. Certain tree saps could be mixed into the paste, creating barriers that were more water-resistant and longer-lasting. Pine sap was especially valuable because it created natural antiseptic barriers that helped prevent infections while providing additional waterproofing. Beeswax, when honey could be found, provided the ultimate enhancement to protective skin coatings. The natural wax created barriers that were completely waterproof while remaining flexible at body temperature. Mixed with fat and charcoal, beeswax created protective coatings that could last for days without reapplication, shedding moisture while retaining heat and providing complete wind protection. The application process became a family ritual that served multiple purposes beyond simple protection. Family members helped each other apply the protective coatings, ensuring complete coverage while strengthening social bonds during the stressful winter months. And children learned the techniques by helping apply coatings to adults, developing the skills they would need to protect their own families in the future. They learned to read weather signs that indicated when protective applications were necessary. Changes in wind direction, cloud formations, and animal behavior all provided clues about approaching conditions that would require enhanced skin protection. Emergency applications could be prepared quickly when unexpected weather threatened family members who were caught away from shelter. The timing of applications was critical for maximum effectiveness. Applied too early, and the protective coatings would wear off before the most dangerous conditions arrived. Applied too late, and exposed skin might already be damaged by cold exposure. They learned to predict weather patterns and time their protective applications to provide maximum coverage during the most dangerous periods. Removal and reapplication required understanding how the protective coatings interacted with skin over time. Leaving coatings on too long could cause skin irritation or infection. Removing them too early left skin vulnerable to damage. They developed techniques for partial removal and reapplication that maintain protection while allowing skin to recover from heavy coating applications. These protective systems worked in conjunction with clothing and shelter to create complete defensive barriers against conditions that should have killed unprotected humans. But the protection was only as effective as the people who applied and maintained it, and some family members required special consideration and enhanced protection techniques that went far beyond what healthy adults needed to survive. In the brutal mathematics of Ice Age survival, not all lives were equal in their ability to generate and retain the heat necessary for survival. Children, with their smaller bodies and faster metabolisms, burn through calories like tiny furnaces running at maximum capacity, yet produced less total heat than adults. Elderly family members, with slower circulation and reduced muscle mass, struggled to maintain the internal temperatures that kept death at bay. And pregnant women carried precious cargo that demanded additional calories and warmth while compromising their own survival efficiency. These vulnerable family members required protection strategies that went far beyond the techniques that kept healthy adults alive. They needed specialized care, enhanced thermal protection, and constant monitoring that transformed winter survival from individual endurance into community effort. The survival of these vulnerable individuals often determined whether families emerged from winter as intact units or as scattered survivors carrying the unbearable weight of irreplaceable losses. The children presented unique challenges that required completely different approaches to thermal management. Their higher surface area to body mass ratio meant they lost heat faster than adults, while their developing circulatory systems couldn't efficiently move warm blood to extremities during cold stress. Yet their faster metabolisms meant they needed more calories per pound of body weight, and creating a cruel equation where those least able to conserve heat needed the most energy to produce it. The positioning of children within the cave was strategic thermal engineering that placed them in the warmest available microclimates. They slept closest to the fire, not just near it but in the exact spots where heat distribution most concentrated and consistent. These weren't the most comfortable positions, they were the positions where mathematical calculations of heat transfer meant the difference between survival and death for small bodies that couldn't maintain temperature on their own. Layering systems for children were elaborate constructions that turned them into tiny thermal fortresses. While adults might sleep comfortably with 2 or 3 layers of insulation, children were wrapped in 4, 5, sometimes 6 layers of the finest available furs and hides. These weren't random applications of more material, they were engineered systems where each layer served a specific thermal function. The innermost layer against a child's skin was the softest available material. often rabbit fur or bird down that provided insulation without chafing delicate skin. The middle layers were arranged to trap air in multiple thermal zones, creating insulation systems that worked even if outer layers were compromised. The outer layers provided wind protection and moisture management, sealing the thermal system while allowing enough ventilation to prevent dangerous overheating. Adults formed human heating systems around sleeping children, positioning themselves to direct their own body heat toward family members who couldn't generate enough internal warmth. These weren't casual sleeping arrangements, they were calculated thermal support systems where larger bodies with higher heat output became living radiators that kept smaller bodies within the temperature ranges necessary for survival. The most effective arrangements positioned children between adults, creating thermal sandwiches where shared body heat could maintain comfortable temperatures even during the coldest parts of the night. Parents learned to sleep in positions that maximize skin contact with children while maintaining their own comfort and circulation. Arms and legs were arranged to create warming pockets while avoiding positions that could restrict breathing or circulation. The heated stone systems for children required special consideration because their thinner skin was more vulnerable to burns from stones that would be comfortable for adults. The stones were wrapped in multiple layers of soft materials that provided thermal buffers while allowing heat transfer. Smaller stones were used for children, providing gentler heat that could be positioned closer to their bodies without creating dangerous hot spots. Temperature monitoring of children required constant vigilance because their smaller bodies could move from comfortable to dangerously cold much faster than adult bodies. Parents learned to recognize the signs of cold stress in children, changes in breathing patterns, skin color, and responsiveness that indicated thermal systems were being overwhelmed before obvious symptoms like shivering appeared. Feeding strategies for children during winter required understanding their unique metabolic needs and providing calorie-dense foods that could sustain their higher energy requirements. Fat and protein were especially important because children's bodies needed both the energy to generate heat and the building blocks to maintain growth during periods of extreme stress. But children weren't the only vulnerable family members who required specialized protection. Elderly individuals faced different but equally serious challenges that demanded their own survival strategies. Age brought reduced circulation, slower metabolism, and decreased muscle mass that all combined to make heat generation and retention more difficult. Elderly family members received priority, positioning that balanced their need for warmth with their wisdom and experience. While they needed the warmest available sleeping areas, they also served as the repositories of survival knowledge that could keep entire families alive. Their positioning within the cave reflected both their thermal needs and their value as sources of essential survival information. The layering systems for elderly family members emphasized heat retention over mobility, creating thermal cocoons that maximized insulation while acknowledging that older bodies moved less and generated less internal heat. Additional layers focused on core warming, understanding that maintaining body core temperature was more critical than extremity comfort for individuals whose circulation was already compromised. Heated stone therapy for elderly family members was often more elaborate than for other adults, with carefully arranged systems of warming stones that provided external heat sources to supplement reduced internal heat production. These stone arrangements were positioned to warm large muscle groups and major organs, supporting circulation and maintaining core temperature through external heat application. Special attention was paid to extremity warming for elderly family members because their reduced circulation made them especially vulnerable to frostbite and cold injury. Hands and feet received enhanced protection through specialized wrapping techniques and additional heat sources that maintained circulation even when the body's natural heat distribution was compromised. Breathing support for elderly family members included techniques for maintaining clear airways and supporting respiratory function during cold stress. Cold air could trigger respiratory problems in older individuals, so they were positioned where they could breathe warmed air that had been heated by the fire and moderated by the cave's thermal environment. And pregnant women presented unique challenges that required balancing the needs of two individuals with different thermal requirements, while supporting the additional caloric demands of pregnancy during the most resource-scarce time of year. Pregnancy increased caloric needs while potentially compromising circulation and heat distribution, creating complex thermal management requirements. Positioning for pregnant women emphasized comfort and thermal support while accommodating the physical changes that affected sleeping positions and heat distribution. Special sleeping arrangements provided support for changing body shapes while maintaining access to heat sources and ensuring comfortable rest that was essential for healthy pregnancy outcomes. Nutritional support for pregnant women required allocating additional calories and specific nutrients that supported both maternal health and fetal development during periods when food resources were severely limited. This often meant other family members sacrificed their own nutrition to ensure pregnant women received adequate calories and essential nutrients. The monitoring of vulnerable family members required family members to sacrifice their own sleep and comfort to maintain constant vigilance over those who couldn't adequately monitor their own thermal status. Adults took turns throughout the night checking for signs of cold stress, adjusting insulation systems, and maintaining the heating systems that kept their most vulnerable family members alive. These protective systems required enormous investments of time, energy, and resources that stretched family survival capabilities to their limits. But they were investments that determined whether families survived winter as complete units or emerged as broken remnants carrying the trauma of preventable losses. The care of vulnerable family members was often the difference between cultural continuity and cultural collapse, because these individuals carried irreplaceable knowledge, relationships, and genetic heritage that couldn't be recovered if they were lost to preventable cold-related deaths. But all of these careful preparations, all of this sophisticated thermal engineering, all of these elaborate protection systems could be destroyed in minutes if the wrong visitors came calling during the long darkness. The same conditions that made human survival so challenging also made other creatures desperate, hungry, and willing to take deadly risks to acquire the warmth, food, and shelter that human families had worked so hard to create and protect. In the deep winter darkness, when snow muffled sound and cold drove all creatures to desperation, the warm glow of firelight and the rich sense of cooked food made human shelters into beacons that attracted every hungry, desperate, and dangerous thing that moved through the frozen landscape. Bears seeking winter dens, wolf packs driven to desperate boldness by starvation, and cave lions whose territorial instincts made them willing to fight for the prime shelters that humans had claimed. The same thermal engineering that kept families alive also made them targets for creatures facing their own life or death struggles against the killing cold. A warm cave with a well-maintained fire represented salvation for human families, but it also represented contested territory for animals equipped with claws, teeth, and the kind of predatory desperation that made them willing to kill for what humans had claimed. Defense against these threats required understanding predator behavior, developing early warning systems, creating physical barriers, and preparing response strategies that could protect vulnerable family members while preserving the thermal systems that kept everyone alive. This wasn't just about fighting off occasional animal attacks, it was about managing sustained siege conditions where multiple threats might test human defenses throughout the long winter months. The foundation of predator defense was understanding animal behavior patterns during winter conditions. Desperate animals took risks they would never consider during abundant seasons. Normally solitary predators might hunt in groups. Normally cautious animals might approach human settlements with boldness born of starvation. Normally territorial animals might abandon their usual hunting grounds to compete for resources that could mean the difference between survival and death. The bears presented perhaps the most serious threat, because they were large enough to kill multiple humans, intelligent enough to understand that caves represented valuable territory, and desperate enough during pre-hibernation periods to fight for prime denning sites. Cave bears, in particular, considered the best caves to be their ancestral territory, and they had the size and strength to enforce their claims against human interlopers. Understanding behavior meant recognizing the signs of recent bear activity around potential shelter sites. Fresh claw marks on cave walls, scat that indicated recent feeding, bedding areas that showed signs of use. All of these were warnings that choosing a particular cave meant entering into territorial disputes with creatures that weighed several times more than adult humans and had weapons that could kill with single strikes. But bears weren't the only threats. Wolf packs driven to desperation by winter starvation would test human defenses with coordinated attacks that leveraged pack intelligence and persistence. Unlike bears, which might be discouraged by strong resistance, wolf packs could maintain siege conditions, awaiting outside caves for opportunities created by human weakness, exhaustion, or mistakes in defensive preparation. Wolves hunted with intelligence that matched human planning capabilities, learning human routines and identifying vulnerable individuals who might be separated from group protection. They understood that human families included members who couldn't defend themselves effectively, and they developed attack strategies that targeted children, elderly individuals, or anyone who might be caught outside the protection of the group. Large cats like cave lions presented different threats that required different defensive strategies. These solitary predators combined massive size with hunting skills that made them capable of killing adult humans in single combat. Unlike pack hunters, they typically attacked alone, but their attacks were devastating enough that surviving a single encounter required preparation, weapons, and defensive techniques that could creatures designed by evolution to kill large prey. Early warning systems were essential for providing the time necessary to implement defensive measures before attacks developed into life-threatening emergencies. These systems had to work in conditions where visibility was limited, sound was muffled by snow, and human senses were compromised by cold stress and the constant demands of winter survival activities. Dogs, when available, provided the most effective early warning systems because their senses were superior to human capabilities, while their loyalty made them reliable sentries who would alert families to approaching threats. But dogs weren't always available, and maintaining dogs through winter required additional food resources that struggling families might not be able to spare. Dog training for predator detection was sophisticated behavioral conditioning that taught dogs to distinguish between different types of threats and communicate specific information about approaching dangers. Different barking patterns indicated different types of approaching animals. Body language and positioning provided additional information about the location, size, and behavior of detected threats. Training dogs to work effectively in winter conditions required understanding how cold affected their senses and capabilities. Dogs needed their own thermal protection to maintain effectiveness during extended periods of cold weather monitoring. Their food requirements increased during winter, both because of the additional calories needed for cold weather survival and because of the energy demands of constant vigilance. Alternative early warning systems had to be developed for families who didn't have dogs or whose dogs were injured, sick, or otherwise unable to perform sentry duties. These systems relied on human observation skills enhanced by understanding of how sounds and movements traveled through winter landscapes. And sound detection required learning to identify the acoustic signatures of different animals moving through snow and frozen ground. The footfall patterns of bears were different from those of wolves or large cats. The breathing sounds of large predators could be detected by trained human ears under ideal conditions. Even the sounds of predators moving through vegetation or over snow could provide warning for those who knew how to listen. Visual detection systems worked even in limited light conditions by understanding how animal movement patterns differed from natural landscape changes. The movement of snow or vegetation caused by large animals was different from movement caused by wind. The disruption of natural patterns could indicate approaching threats, even when the animals themselves weren't visible. Physical barriers provided defense systems that didn't depend on human alertness or reaction time. These barriers had to be effective against determined predators while not interfering with human movement, ventilation, or emergency escape routes. The barriers also had to be constructed from materials that were available during winter conditions and could be maintained without excessive labor investment. Snow barriers were the most available construction material, but they had to be built with understanding of how different snow types provided different defensive capabilities. Packed snow could create walls that would deter casual investigation by predators while providing windbreaks that improved thermal conditions around cave entrances. But packed snow barriers wouldn't stop determined attacks by large predators. Stone barriers provided more substantial protection, but required significant labor investment and access to suitable building materials. Stone walls around cave entrances could channel approaching predators toward areas where they could be more easily detected and defended against. The stones also provided projectile ammunition that could be used to discourage predators without requiring close combat. Brush barriers used available vegetation to create obstacles that slowed predator approaches while providing early warning when animals had to move through tangled materials that created noise and left obvious sign. These barriers were particularly effective against hunters who relied on coordinated movement, because the barriers disrupted pack formations and forced individual animals to approach through predictable paths. Fire barriers extended the defensive perimeter beyond the immediate cave area by creating zones that most predators would avoid. Torches and firebrands could be placed strategically to create psychological barriers that discouraged approach while providing additional light for detection of threats that did approach despite the fire deterrent. Weapon placement within caves followed protocols that balanced quick access with safety around family members and sleeping areas. Spears, clubs, and cutting tools had to be positioned where they could be reached instantly by adults who might be awakened by sudden threats. The weapons also had to be arranged so they wouldn't be knocked over or damaged during normal cave activities. Different weapons were effective against different types of threats. Spears provided reach advantage against large predators, but required space for effective use. Clubs were effective in confined spaces, but required close combat that increased injury risk. Cutting tools could be devastating against smaller predators, but were less effective against creatures with thick hides or heavy for protection. Weapon maintenance during winter required understanding how cold affected tool performance and reliability. Metal tools, when available, became brittle in extreme cold and could shatter during critical moments. Wooden tools required protection from moisture that could weaken joints and handles. Stone tools needed to be checked for stress fractures that could cause failure during combat. Combat strategies for different predator types required understanding animal attack patterns and developing response techniques that maximized human advantages while minimizing exposure to animal weapons. Fighting bears required different tactics than fighting wolves or large cats, because each type of predator had different attack patterns, vulnerable areas, and behavioral responses to human resistance. Group defense strategies coordinated multiple family members in defensive actions that leveraged human intelligence and cooperation against individual predators or predator groups that might overwhelm single defenders. These strategies assigned specific roles to different family members based on their capabilities, positioning, and access to weapons. Adult males typically served as primary defenders with responsibility for engaging threats directly while protecting other family members. Adult females often served as secondary defenders with responsibility for protecting children and maintaining defensive positions while supporting primary defenders. And children and elderly family members were assigned protection roles that kept them safe while contributing to group defense capabilities. Escape strategies prepared families for situations where defensive positions became untenable and retreat was necessary for survival. These strategies included predetermined routes, equipment caches, and backup shelter locations that could provide refuge if primary caves were compromised by predator threats or other emergencies. Emergency protocols coordinated responses to different threat scenarios, from single predator approaches to sustained siege conditions that might last for days. These protocols assigned responsibilities, established communication methods, and created decision trees that helped families respond effectively to threats without panic or confusion that could turn manageable situations into deadly disasters. The psychological aspects of predator defense were as important as the physical preparations. Living under constant threat of deadly attack created stress that could compromise decision-making, family relationships, and the mental health necessary for long-term survival. Families had to develop coping strategies that maintained vigilance without creating paralyzing fear that made normal survival activities impossible. Children required special psychological support to help them understand threats without developing debilitating fear that would interfere with their development and future survival capabilities. They needed to learn defensive skills and awareness without losing the curiosity and resilience that were essential for human adaptability and cultural continuation. The integration of defensive systems with thermal management systems required balancing security needs with the thermal engineering that kept families alive through winter conditions. Defensive barriers couldn't interfere with ventilation systems that managed fire smoke and air circulation, where weapon placement couldn't compromise the sleeping arrangements that provided shared warmth. Emergency responses couldn't destroy the careful thermal systems that represented months of preparation and maintenance. These defensive systems worked as part of the complete survival strategy that enabled human families to survive conditions that should have killed them. The 7 ancient secrets: cave selection, fire management, ground insulation, body heat optimization, skin protection, vulnerable member care, and predator defense, worked together as an integrated survival technology that transformed death traps into homes, frozen wastelands into territories that could support human life and culture. In the deepest part of winter, when the world had been frozen for months and would remain frozen for months more, when the memory of warmth seemed like a dream and the promise of spring felt like a lie whispered by desperate minds, our ancestors lived and thrived in conditions that would kill modern humans equipped with the best technology in hours. They didn't just survive, they created art in those caves, told stories that preserved their culture, raised children who grew strong and healthy, maintained the complex social relationships that kept human communities functioning. They made love and laughed and dreamed of the future, all while existing in an environment that was actively trying to kill them every moment of every day. How was this possible? The answer lies in understanding that none of the 7 ancient secrets worked in isolation. Each technique was part of an integrated system where every element supported and enhanced every other element, creating survival capabilities that were far greater than the sum of their individual parts. This wasn't just survival technology, it was survival artistry that transformed the hostile environment into something approaching comfort. The cave selection wasn't just about finding shelter. It was about finding shelter that worked with fire management systems that could heat the space efficiently while providing ventilation that prevented suffocation. The geological features that made caves suitable for habitation were the same features that made fire management possible, creating natural chimney effects and air circulation patterns that allowed safe indoor fires. Fire management wasn't just about staying warm, it was about creating heat sources that could warm the ground insulation systems that protected sleeping families while providing the heated stones that formed the foundations of thermal protection for vulnerable family members. The fire provided not just heat, but the light necessary for weapon maintenance, the warmth necessary for rendering animal fats used in skin protection, and the psychological comfort that kept families functioning during months of darkness. Ground insulation systems weren't just about comfort, They were about creating thermal environments that worked with body heat management techniques to multiply the effectiveness of internal heat production while providing the foundation for sleeping arrangements that protected vulnerable family members. The insulated sleeping areas created microclimates that allowed families to survive with less firewood, conserving precious fuel resources for the longest, coldest parts of winter. Body heat management techniques weren't just about staying warm. They were about optimizing internal heat production that worked with skin protection systems to create complete thermal barriers while supporting the physical conditioning necessary for defensive activities and survival work. The breathing techniques and exercise patterns that generated internal heat also maintained the physical fitness necessary for hunting, gathering firewood, and defending against predators. Skin protection systems weren't just about preventing frostbite, they were about creating barriers that worked with clothing and shelter systems to multiply thermal effectiveness while providing the protection necessary for outdoor activities that maintained the cave, gathered resources, and responded to emergencies. The fat and charcoal applications created waterproof barriers that prevented the moisture problems that could compromise clothing insulation and ground bedding systems. Care for vulnerable family members wasn't just about compassion, it was about preserving the knowledge, relationships, and genetic heritage that represented the accumulated wisdom and future potential of human communities. Children carried the future of the group. Elderly members carried irreplaceable survival knowledge. Protecting these individuals ensured cultural continuity and maintained the social structures that made complex survival strategies possible. And predator defense systems weren't just about fighting off animals, they were about protecting all of the other survival systems from disruption while maintaining the psychological health necessary for long-term survival. Effective predator defense allowed families to maintain their thermal systems, continue their survival activities, and preserve the social relationships that made human cooperation possible. But perhaps most importantly, all of these systems worked together to create something that went far beyond mere physical survival. They created the conditions that allowed human culture to continue during the most challenging periods in human history. They preserved the stories, songs, knowledge, and relationships that made survival meaningful rather than just an endless struggle to delay death. The caves where our ancestors survived became centers of human culture during the long winter months. Around carefully managed fires, on carefully prepared ground insulation, protected by carefully constructed defensive systems, families told the stories that preserved their history and passed essential survival knowledge to the next generation. Children learned the techniques that would keep their own families alive by participating in the daily maintenance of survival systems. They learned cave selection by helping evaluate potential sites. They learned fire management by helping tend flames and manage fuel. They learned ground preparation by helping construct and maintain sleeping systems. They learned body heat management by practicing the exercises and breathing techniques that would serve them throughout their lives. The knowledge was embedded in daily activities that made survival education a natural part of growing up rather than abstract instruction that might be forgotten during emergencies. Children learned by doing, by helping, by gradually taking on more responsibility for the systems that kept their families alive. Adults maintained their survival skills through constant practice and refinement, understanding that expertise was the difference between life and death when conditions pushed survival systems to their limits. They experimented with new techniques, improved existing methods, and adapted their approaches to changing conditions and available resources. The social structures that supported survival were themselves products of the survival systems. Families that could keep their members alive through multiple winters developed trust, cooperation, and mutual dependence that strengthened community bonds. And successful survival created the social capital that made future survival more likely by building networks of mutual support and shared knowledge. The psychological resilience that made long-term survival possible was supported by the daily successes of the survival systems. Each night that families stayed warm, each morning they woke up alive, each meal they cooked over carefully managed fires, each day they successfully protected their vulnerable members. All of these small victories built the mental strength necessary to continue fighting against conditions that could easily crush human morale. The spiritual dimensions of survival were expressed through the reverence for fire, earth, and the natural systems that supported human life. The daily rituals of fire tending, ground preparation, and protective care became expressions of gratitude for the forces that made survival possible. The survival systems became sacred practices that connected families to the natural world and to the ancestors who had developed and passed down the knowledge that kept them alive. The artistic expression that flourished in survival caves wasn't separate from survival, it was part of survival, preserving cultural knowledge and providing the psychological nourishment that made survival meaningful. The cave paintings that modern archaeologists study weren't just art, they were cultural survival technology that preserved essential knowledge while providing the spiritual sustenance that kept human communities functioning during the darkest periods. The long winter nights became opportunities for storytelling, tool-making, and cultural transmission that strengthened family bonds while preserving the knowledge that would be essential for future survival. The survival systems created the time and space necessary for these activities by reducing the energy required for basic survival, allowing families to invest time in cultural activities that enhanced their resilience and adaptability. The relationship between survival and culture was symbiotic. Survival systems preserved the people who carried culture, while cultural activities strengthened the social bonds and knowledge networks that made sophisticated survival systems possible. Neither could exist without the other, and both were necessary for human communities to thrive during conditions that challenged every aspect of human adaptability. The seasonal rhythms of survival created annual cycles that structured community life and provided frameworks for planning, preparation, and cultural celebration. The successful completion of each winter was a community victory that deserved celebration while providing motivation for the preparations that would be necessary for the next winter's challenges. The knowledge accumulated through these survival experiences became the foundation for all future human technological and cultural development. The understanding of thermal dynamics, materials science, and environmental management that our ancestors developed during Ice Age winters provided the conceptual frameworks that would eventually lead to architecture, engineering, and the complex technologies that support modern civilization. But perhaps most importantly, the survival systems our ancestors developed proved something profound about human capabilities, that with sufficient knowledge, cooperation, and determination, humans could thrive anywhere. The same intelligence that kept families alive in Ice Age caves would eventually take humans to every continent, every environment, and ultimately beyond the planet itself. The 7 ancient secrets weren't just survival techniques, they were proof of concept for human adaptability, demonstrations that human intelligence could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when applied with creativity, persistence, and communal effort. They showed that humans weren't just another animal species, competing for limited resources. They were a new kind of life form that could reshape hostile environments into livable spaces through knowledge and cooperation. As the first pale light of dawn touches the ancient cave paintings that still mark the walls where our ancestors survived the impossible, we can see the ghost light of fires that burned 30,000 years ago, feel the echo of warmth from sleeping firs arranged with mathematical precision, hear the whisper of stories told around flames that kept families alive through the longest nights in human history. These survival systems didn't disappear when the Ice Age ended. They transformed, evolved, became the foundations of everything that followed. Every modern comfort, every technological marvel, every system that keeps you warm and safe tonight carries the DNA of those ancient survival techniques developed in caves that should have been tombs but became cradles of human ingenuity instead. your central heating system, humming invisibly in the walls of your home, is the great-great-grandchild of those carefully managed cave fires that had to provide warmth without smoke, heat without consuming precious fuel, life without death. The thermostat that maintains perfect temperature in your bedroom descended from the human fire tenders who monitored flames through the night, reading the language of coals and flame color to maintain the precise heat that kept families alive until morning. The insulation in your walls, the double-paned windows that trap warm air, the weather stripping that seals out drafts, all of these are technological descendants of the ground insulation systems that turned frozen cave floors into warm sleeping areas. The engineering principles that keep your house warm were discovered by people using mammoth hides and heated stones, learning through desperation the physics of heat transfer and thermal mass that modern engineers study in universities. Your waterproof jacket, with its breathable fabrics and sealed seams, evolved from the skin protection systems that used animal fat and charcoal to create barriers against wind and moisture. The materials have changed from bare fat to synthetic polymers, but the underlying concept remains identical, creating protective barriers that shield human skin from environmental conditions that could kill. The layers you wear during winter, base layers that wick moisture, insulation layers that trap warm air, and shell layers that block wind, these are direct descendants of the sophisticated clothing systems our ancestors developed using rabbit fur, bird down, and carefully arranged animal hides. The principles of layered insulation haven't changed, only the materials have improved. Your emergency preparedness supplies, stored in basement or garage against the possibility of power outages or natural disasters, represent the same kind of forward thinking that made our ancestors gather firewood during autumn, prepare winter clothing during summer, and maintain the tools and supplies that would keep families alive during the months when resources were scarce. The early warning systems that protect modern communities, weather forecasting, emergency broadcast systems, smoke detectors, security alarms, all descended from the watchfulness that kept cave families alert to approaching threats. The technology has advanced from human senses and dog hearing to satellite imagery and electronic sensors, but the purpose remains the same, providing enough warning to implement protective measures before dangers become deadly. Modern medical care for vulnerable populations, pediatric medicine, geriatric care, prenatal support, represents the evolution of the specialized protection systems that kept children, elderly family members, and pregnant women alive during conditions that challenged even healthy adults. And the understanding that different individuals need different levels of care and protection hasn't changed. Even though the techniques have advanced from heated stones and extra furs to hospitals and sophisticated medical technologies, the community support systems that help families during emergencies, disaster relief, social services, mutual aid networks evolved from the cooperative survival strategies that made winter survival possible for extended families and small communities. The recognition that individual survival depends on community resources and that communities have responsibilities to protect their most vulnerable members traces directly back to those Ice Age survival groups. Even the psychological techniques that help modern people cope with stress, trauma, and challenging conditions have roots in the mental resilience that our ancestors developed to survive months of darkness, constant threat, of hunger, and the psychological pressure of knowing that small mistakes could result in death for themselves and their families. The stories we tell ourselves about human capability, about our ability to overcome challenges and adapt to difficult conditions, were born in those caves where families proved that human intelligence and cooperation could trump over environments that should have been impossible to survive. Every modern story about human resilience, every narrative about overcoming adversity, carries the echo of those first survival victories. The respect for expertise and specialized knowledge that characterizes modern technical fields reflects the understanding, developed during Ice Age winters, that survival depended on mastering complex skills and passing that knowledge to others who would need it. The apprenticeship systems that preserve craft knowledge, the educational institutions that train professionals, the cultural emphasis on learning and skill development, all of these trace back to the critical importance of survival expertise in early human communities. The environmental awareness that drives modern conservation efforts emerged from the intimate understanding of natural systems that our ancestors needed to survive. They couldn't afford to misunderstand weather patterns, animal behavior, seasonal changes, or resource availability, because such misunderstandings could kill entire families. The modern environmental movement, with its emphasis on understanding and protecting natural systems, represents the evolution of survival wisdom that recognized human dependence on healthy ecosystems. The collaborative technologies that define modern life, from the internet to supply chains to global transportation networks, evolved from the cooperation systems that made complex survival strategies possible. Our ancestors learned that individual survival depended on group knowledge, shared resources, and coordinated effort. Modern technological civilization represents the ultimate expression of that same insight, scaled up from family groups to global communities. Even our relationship with risk and uncertainty was shaped by those ancient survival experiences. The insurance systems that protect modern families against disaster, the emergency planning that prepares communities for crisis, the redundant systems that prevent single points of failure, all of these reflect the understanding, learned in Ice Age caves, that survival requires preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The very concept of home, the psychological significance we attach to warm, safe spaces where families gather and children grow, was born in those caves where warmth and safety had to be created from nothing but knowledge, materials, and human effort. The emotional content of home are the feelings of security, comfort, and belonging that we associate with domestic space, originated in places where these feelings meant the difference between psychological resilience and crushing despair. The seasonal rhythms that still structure modern life, even in urban environments largely disconnected from natural cycles, echo the seasonal preparation patterns that kept Ice Age families alive. The autumn impulse to prepare for winter, the spring celebration of renewal and growth, the summer emphasis on activity and accumulation, these psychological patterns developed when seasonal awareness was essential for survival. The value systems that emphasize family protection, community cooperation, and mutual responsibility emerged from conditions where these values were literally matters of life and death. The moral frameworks that prioritize the care of children and elderly family members, the ethical systems that emphasize community support during crisis, the cultural norms that value expertise and knowledge sharing, all of these developed in communities where survival depended on these principles. The aesthetics of comfort, our attraction to fireplaces, soft textures, warm colors, enclosed spaces, reflect the positive associations with survival systems that kept our ancestors alive. The psychological comfort we derive from these environmental features traces back to times when such features meant survival rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. The human fascination with stories about survival, adventure, and overcoming adversity reflects the cultural importance of preserving and celebrating the knowledge and resilience that enabled human communities to survive impossible conditions. Every survival story, from ancient myths to modern adventure narratives, carries forward the cultural memory of times when such knowledge was essential for community survival. The importance we place on education and skill development reflects the understanding that knowledge can mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving, between adapting successfully to challenging conditions and being overwhelmed by them. The educational systems that preserve and transmit human knowledge evolved from the survival knowledge systems that kept families alive during Ice Age winters. But perhaps most profoundly, the modern human sense of possibility, our belief that no challenge is insurmountable, no environment uninhabitable, no problem unsolvable, was born in those caves where families proved that human intelligence could triumph over conditions that should have been impossible to survive. The space programs that have taken humans beyond Earth's atmosphere, the technologies that allow humans to survive in the deepest oceans and highest mountains, the medical advances that keep people alive under conditions that would have been fatal just generations ago. All of these represent the evolution of the same human capabilities that enabled Ice Age survival. The confidence that drives human exploration and innovation, the willingness to attempt what seems impossible, the faith in human adaptability and problem-solving ability, these psychological foundations were established by ancestors who faced genuine impossibility and won. Every time modern humans venture into hostile environments, whether Antarctic researchers, deep-sea explorers, astronauts, or emergency responders working in disaster zones, they carry forward the legacy of those Ice Age survivors who proved that human knowledge and cooperation could create habitability in the most uninhabitable conditions. The technological optimism that believes human ingenuity can solve climate change, poverty, disease, and other global challenges reflects the same confidence that enabled families to believe they could survive conditions that killed every other species of similar size and metabolic requirements. The social movements that work to ensure no human suffers from preventable causes, hunger, homelessness, lack of medical care, or social isolation, represent the evolution of the community care systems that ensured vulnerable family members survived the winter months when individual survival was impossible. The research institutions that study human potential, the educational systems that develop human capabilities, the cultural institutions that preserve and transmit human knowledge, all of these represent the systematic development of the same human resources that enabled Ice Age survival. But the most important legacy of those ancient survival systems might be something less tangible, but more fundamental, the proof of concept they provided for human potential itself. They demonstrated that humans weren't just another animal species competing for limited resources within narrow environmental niches. They showed that humans were something new in the history of life on Earth, creatures capable of using knowledge and cooperation to expand their environmental possibilities rather than being constrained by them. The 7 ancient secrets proved that humans could transform hostile environments into livable spaces, that human communities could protect their most vulnerable members even during the most challenging conditions, that human knowledge could overcome what seemed like insurmountable natural limitations. This legacy lives on in every human community that refuses to accept that challenging conditions must result in suffering. In every technological development that expands human capabilities, in every social system that protects vulnerable individuals, in every educational effort that preserves and transmits human knowledge, the same intelligence that learned to manage fire in stone chambers, to create thermal barriers from animal fat and charcoal, to turn frozen ground into warm sleeping areas, to organize community defense against predators, this intelligence continues to work on the challenges that face modern human communities. Climate change, resource scarcity, technological disruption, social inequality, these are the Ice Age winters of modern civilization, the challenges that require the same kind of innovative thinking, community cooperation, and systematic preparation that enabled our ancestors to survive conditions that should have been impossible. The solutions will be different: photovoltaic cells instead of carefully managed fires, synthetic insulation instead of mammoth hides, global communication networks instead of family-based knowledge systems, but the underlying human capabilities remain the same. The confidence to attempt solutions to seemingly impossible problems, the willingness to experiment with new approaches, the understanding that individual survival depends on community success, the commitment to protecting vulnerable community members, the faith in human adaptability, these are the inheritance from those Ice Age survivors. When modern humans look up at the stars and plan missions to Mars, when they design technologies to reverse environmental damage, when they create social systems to eliminate poverty and inequality, when they work to ensure that every human child has the opportunity to develop their full potential, they are using the same human capabilities that enabled families to survive in caves during the darkest periods in human history. The 7 ancient secrets weren't just survival techniques, they were proof that human intelligence, when applied with creativity, persistence, and community cooperation, could overcome any challenge. They established the foundation for every human achievement that followed. From the first farms to the first cities, the first space missions. And they continue to inspire human effort toward challenges that might seem impossible, but which human history suggests are just the next problems waiting for human ingenuity to solve them. The fires that warmed Ice Age caves have long since turned to ash, but their light continues to illuminate human possibility. The families that survived impossible winters have long since joined their ancestors, but their legacy lives on in every human community that refuses to accept that challenging conditions must result in suffering. Their greatest discovery wasn't any particular survival technique. It was the discovery that humans could survive anything if they brought enough knowledge, cooperation, and determination to the challenge. That discovery continues to drive human achievement, human exploration, and human hope. Tonight, as you sleep warm and safe in your modern home, remember that your comfort rests on foundations built by people who learned to create warmth and safety from nothing but stone, fire, and human ingenuity. Their legacy isn't just the techniques they developed it's the proof they provided that human communities can overcome any challenge if they understand the challenge clearly enough and work together persistently enough to develop solutions. The darkness they faced was deeper than any darkness modern humans experience, but they learned to create light. The cold they endured was more bitter than any cold modern humans must survive, but they learned to create warmth. The dangers they confronted were more immediate than any dangers modern humans face, but they learned to create safety. Their story is your story, because their survival is what made your existence possible. Their techniques evolved into your technologies, their cooperation became your civilization, and their success became your inheritance. And their greatest lesson remains as relevant today as it was 30,000 years ago, that humans armed with knowledge, united in cooperation, and committed to the protection of their communities can overcome any challenge the universe presents. The cave fires have been extinguished for millennia, but their warmth continues to sustain human hope. The ancient winters ended long ago, but the resilience they taught continues to strengthen human resolve. Rest well tonight, inheritor of survival wisdom, carrier of ancient knowledge, descendant of the Ice Age survivors who proved that human communities can thrive anywhere. Tomorrow brings new challenges that will require the same intelligence, cooperation, and determination that kept your ancestors alive through the longest nights in human history. The 7 ancient secrets live on in every human who refuses to accept that challenging conditions must result in defeat. In every community that protects its most vulnerable members, in every individual who contributes their knowledge and effort to collective survival and thriving. Sleep warm, sleep safe, sleep proud of the heritage you carry and the future you're helping to create. The ancestors are watching, and they're proud of how far their children have come. Some nights, when the wind is just right and the darkness feels deeper than usual, you can still hear them, the voices of those first survivors, telling their stories around fires that burned when the world was younger and harder and more dangerous. They speak across the centuries, reminding us that we are here because they refused to surrender, because they learned that human intelligence could overcome any challenge, because they discovered that cooperation and knowledge could transform death traps into homes. Their fires may have gone out, but the light they kindled still burns in every human heart that refuses to accept defeat, in every mind that seeks solutions instead of surrendering to problems, in every community that chooses cooperation over conflict. Listen carefully on the quiet nights, and you'll hear them still, your ancestors, the Ice Age survivors, the original innovators who proved that humans could thrive anywhere. They're telling you the same they told their own children around those ancient fires. You are stronger than you know. You are smarter than you think. You are part of something larger than yourself, and no darkness lasts forever.